Hello everyone, welcome to another video by Foodemy. In today's video, we'll be discussing the GATE 2023 question paper, Food Technology section part 1. So without any further delay, let's get started. So the first question we have is choose the correct group of fat-soluble vitamins. So we are given with 4 groups and we need to identify the group which contains fat-soluble vitamins. So let's solve this question. Vitamins are basically organic compounds which are required in small amount for essential metabolic function and overall health by the body, and they are categorized on the basis of their solubility as water soluble and fat soluble. Now water soluble are the one which are not stored significantly in the body because they're readily excreted by urine since they are soluble in water, and therefore we need regular intake to maintain adequate levels, and this includes vitamin B and C. Fat soluble are the one which are stored in the body's fatty tissues and liver, and they are absorbed more efficiently when consumed with dietary fat since they are fat soluble, and therefore it includes vitamin A, D, E and K. Now let us look at these in detail. Also water soluble vitamins, which includes vitamin B, which further includes B1, B2, B3, B5, B6, B7, B9 and finally B12, and vitamin C are the ones which are part of water soluble vitamins. So their chemical names, so a trick to remember the chemical names for the B family, basically we can remember this acronym TRN, train, parts per billion, has food contamination. So in this order we can remember thymine, riboflavin, TRN, niacin, parts per billion, so PPB, so pantothenic acid, pyridoxine, biotin, and then FC, which is folic acid and cobalamin. And for vitamin C, the chemical name is ascorbic acid. And then for vitamin A, the name is retinol. Vitamin D further has 2 forms, D3 and D2, which is cholecalciferol and ergocalciferol. Vitamin E, tocopherols or tocotrienols, and vitamin K has K1, K2 or K3, which are known as phylloquinone, menaquinone or menadione respectively. So now let us look at this question. So the first options is number 1, cholecalciferol, which is the name for vitamin D as we have just seen, alpha tocopherol, the name for vitamin E, and menadione, which is the name for vitamin K. So we have just studied that vitamin A, D, E and K. So therefore this is a group of fat soluble vitamins. If you look at the next option, it has thymine, which is from the B family, and therefore this is not fat soluble. Next option has niacin, which is again from the vitamin B family and not a fat soluble vitamin, and option D has biotin, thymine, niacin. All of them belong to vitamin B family and therefore they are not fat soluble. Therefore the correct answer to this question is option number A. Heading on to the next question, which says the synthesis of thyroxine T4 in human body requires. So to understand this, let's basically understand how the thyroid hormones are formed in the thyroid gland. So basically the thyroid gland is responsible for metabolic rate, growth and energy, and it contains a protein which is known as thyroglobulin. Now in the thyroid gland we have thyroglobulin, which basically contains amino acid, and the most important amino acid we have is tyrosine. This is because it is this tyrosine which further combines with iodine, and once it combines with iodine it forms T4 or T3. Now how this happens, basically the first thing that happens is that the brain releases thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland. Now this hormone tells the thyroid to make these thyroid hormones by the process of iodination, which is basically, as the name suggests, addition of iodine to the tyrosine. As we just discussed, tyrosine needs to add with the iodine to form T4 and T3. So this happens basically by a process known as iodinization, which involves the use of an enzyme known as thyroid peroxidase enzyme. So this enzyme helps the iodine to attach to the tyrosine, and further they form this thyroid hormones which are T4 and T3. So T4 is basically 2 tyrosine group combined with 4 iodine atoms, and T3 is basically 2 tyrosine groups combined with 3 iodine atoms. Now T4 is less active form and it needs to be converted into T3, which again takes place in the body with the help of enzymes. So once these hormones are ready, now they are released into the bloodstream when needed. So now let us look at the role of all these minerals given here one by one. So first is the iodine. As we have just seen, it is an essential element for T4 and T3. As we have just seen, it is iodine which combines with the tyrosine to form T4 and T3. So the thyroid gland absorbs this from the blood and incorporates it into thyroglobulin, which is a precursor protein, through a process known as iodination. Next is selenium. Again, it is needed for one of this particular enzyme which basically helps to change T4 into T3. So what happens is selenium is required for changing this T4 less active form to T3 in the body. Next is iron, which is essential for thyroid peroxidase function, the TPO enzyme which we have just seen, which basically helps in the addition of iodine to tyrosine. Is basically, it is iron helps in that, which catalyzes iodinization of tyrosine to form thyroid hormones. And zinc, it plays a supportive role in thyroid hormone function and it regulates the TSH levels. So now if we summarize, basically iodine is directly needed for T4 and T3 synthesis. Selenium is needed to convert T4 to T3. Iron helps in this iodinization process of tyrosine to produce thyroid hormones, and zinc regulates the TSH levels. Therefore, the correct answer to this question will be iodine, because it is primarily it is the main element which is required for synthesis of thyroxine, and the question was asking that the responsible for a synthesis of thyroxine. Therefore, the correct answer to this question will be iodine. Now heading on to the next question, which among the following is not an essential amino acid? So we are given with four options: phenylalanine, valine, lysine and arginine. So let's solve this question. Now amino acids are basically building blocks of protein which consists of amino group, carboxylic group and variable side chain. They are essential for the protein synthesis. So one side we have an amino group and another side we have a COOH group, and then we have a R group which can vary depending upon what amino acid it is. Now amino acids are categorized as essential or non-essential amino acids. Essential amino acids, as the name suggests, are the one which are essential in diet, basically because they cannot be synthesized by the body. Non-essential amino acids are not essential to be taken by diet because they can be synthesized by the body. So to answer this question, we need to memorize the names of essential amino acids. So in total we have 20 amino acids, and out of those 9 amino acids come in the essential amino acid category. So to remember them, you can use a trick to remember them, as in this. You can remember this acronym as HILL, HILL in MP, and then there's a valley between two trees. So you can use certain other acronym as well, whatever works for you, but you can use this as well. So here from this we have histine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, valine, and then finally tryptophan. So in this order you can memorize them, and therefore the correct answer to this question is arginine, because it is not an essential amino acid, whereas lysine, valine and phenylalanine, as we have just seen, all of them are essential amino acids. So the next question we have is time required for stipulated destruction of microbial population at a given temperature is called, and T value, F value, Z and Q10 value are the options given to us. So to solve this question, we need to know these terms. So let's look at them one by one. So first is D value, which is known as decimal reduction time. It is basically the time required to reduce a microbial population by 90% or 1 log cycle at a specific temperature. Now, it represents the resistance of microorganisms to heat temperature. So, D value is basically given by this formula, where N0 is the initial microbial population, N is the final microbial population, and T is the time taken for a specific reduction, that is 90% reduction or 1 log cycle. Next we have Z value, which is basically the temperature change required to reduce the T value by 1 log cycle or 10-fold. It indicates the thermal resistance of microorganisms, and it is given by this formula. Again here T1 and T2 represents the two temperatures which are being taken, and D1 and D2 are the corresponding D values at these temperatures. Next is F value, which is also known as lethal rate or sterilization value. Now it is the total time required in minutes to kill a known population of microorganisms. So when we have a known population of microorganisms, and it is basically the time required in minutes to kill that at a particular temperature. It considers multiple log reductions, and it is used in food sterilization and thermal processing. So the F value is given by this formula, where again this D represents the D value, and the N by N0 is the initial and the final microbial count. And then we have Q10 value, which is basically the factor by which a reaction rate increases when the temperature is increased by 10 degrees Celsius. So this is basically used to describe the temperature sensitivity of biological and chemical processes. So now we know the meaning of all these terms. So when we go back, the correct answer to this question is F values, as we have just studied, that it is basically the time which is required for the destruction of microbial population at a given temperature. If you want to learn this topic in more detail, you can refer to our video, for which we will attach the link in the description box. Next is match the industrial product in column 1 with the fermentive microorganism which is given in column 2. So what we have here are the products, and here we are given with the fermentive microorganisms, and we need to tell which is the correct match. So let's look at these products one by one. So firstly, vinegar is produced by a two-step process wherein the first involves converting sugar into alcohol, and further that sugar is converted into acetic acid. Now this process is known as alcoholic fermentation, and vinegar is basically produced through the fermentation of ethanol or alcohol by Acetobacter aceti. This bacterium oxidizes ethanol into acetic acid, forming vinegar. Therefore, with vinegar, the correct option will be Acetobacter aceti. Let's look at other products. So next is citric acid. It is commonly produced by a fungus which is Aspergillus niger through fermentation, and it is widely used in food processing as well as pharmaceutical industry. Next is ethanol, which is fermented, as we all know, by Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is baker's yeast. This yeast actually breaks down sugar into ethanol and carbon dioxide during the breaking and the brewing process. And next is L-lysine, which is actually produced through fermentation by Enterobacter aerogenes, a bacterium which is often used in industrial production of amino acids like L-lysine. Therefore, the correct answer to this question is option number A, since vinegar goes with Acetobacter aceti. Next we have citric acid, which goes with Aspergillus niger. Then we have ethanol, which will go with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and then lysine finally, which will go with Enterobacter aerogenes. Therefore, the correct answer to this question is option number A. Heading on to the next question, which is question number 6. It says, which of the following statement is not true? And we are given statements with respect to pseudoplastic fluid, dilatant fluid, etc. So let us understand this concept to answer this question. So firstly, we know that basically this stress is directly proportional to strain. Therefore, it gives us this. Now, we have tau is basically equal to constant, and once we put the value of this constant, we get viscosity and raised to the power n, which is the flow behavior index, and tau naught, which is basically the yield stress. So now if you look at the behavior of the fluids with respect to stress to strain, firstly we have Newtonian fluid, where we see that it follows a linear path. Basically the viscosity at every point therefore will be constant. There is no change in the slope of this, so the viscosity will be constant for Newtonian fluid. But if you look at the dilatant fluid, we see that basically the relationship, it follows a shear thickening behavior. This is because if we look at the viscosity at this point, and if you look at the viscosity at this point, the viscosity at this point will be higher. So it is basically following a shear thickening behavior. And if you look at pseudoplastic behavior, it is following a shear thinning behavior. Next we see that Bingham, thixotropic and rheopectic, after a certain yield stress, Bingham follows the behavior of a Newtonian fluid, that is an exact linear relationship between stress to strain, but it needs a certain yield stress. After that only it will begin to flow. Similarly, rheopectic follows the same behavior as dilatant, which is shear thickening, and thixotropic follows the same behavior as pseudoplastic, that is shear thinning, but it also requires a certain yield stress. Now if you look at these one by one, so Newtonian fluids basically follow a linear relationship between stress and shear rate, such as water, alcohol, mineral oil. Therefore the equation comes, therefore they follow this equation where mu is equal to the viscosity, that stress is directly proportional to strain. And for Newtonian fluids, mu is affected by temperature. The viscosity will be affected by temperature but not influenced by shear rate. Now, if you look at Bingham plastic, they follow the same behavior as Newtonian fluid, but they need a certain yield stress. After that only they start to flow. For example, let's say toothpaste or mayonnaise. So they are not flowing until and unless a yield stress is given to them. But once that yield stress is overcome, they start to flow and behave like Newtonian fluids. So next we have pseudoplastic and dilatant, which we have seen. Pseudoplastic follows shear thinning behavior and dilatant follows shear thickening behavior. And examples for pseudoplastic is ketchup, blood or paints, and for dilatant an example is corn starch and water, and these are time independent fluids. They are not affected by time. Whereas thixotropic and rheopectic follow the same behavior, that is thixotropic decrease in viscosity and rheopectic increase in viscosity, but over the time. Therefore these are time dependent fluids, therefore they are also dependent on time. If we go back to the question now, as the shear rate increases, the apparent viscosity decreases for pseudoplastic fluid. We have seen that this is a correct statement. Next statement, as the shear rate increases, the apparent viscosity increases for dilatant. We have seen that this is also a correct statement. Bingham fluid requires an application of yield stress prior to any response. This is also a correct statement. And the next is rheopectic and thixotropic are two time independent fluid. This is not a correct statement because they are basically time dependent fluids. Therefore, option number D is the correct answer to this question. Now heading on to the next question, question number 7. Match the following enzymes with their application in the food industry. So we are given with 4 enzymes in column 1 and we are given with their uses in the food industries, and we need to match them. So let's look at these enzymes one by one. So first is chymosin. It is basically a protease enzyme. It is used to break down the protein. Primarily it is used in the cheese making process because it helps to coagulate milk by cleaving casein. Especially it cleaves the kappa casein and it forms a gel-like structure which is necessary for curdling of milk to make cheese. Therefore, this enzymatic reaction is very important for the production of different variety of cheese. Next enzyme we have thermolysin, is also a protease enzyme and it is used in the synthesis of aspartame, which is a low calorie artificial sweetener. Basically, it helps in peptide bond cleavage in specific proteins and it plays a role in production of dipeptides, which are actually used in aspartame synthesis. So it breaks down the protein to form dipeptides which are used in aspartame synthesis. Next is beta-galactosidase. Now it is known as lactase. So as the name suggests, to break down lactose, basically this enzyme hydrolyzes lactose into its component sugars, which is glucose and galactose. As we know, lactose is a combination of glucose and galactose. So this enzymatic action is primarily used in the process of lactose hydrolysis to make dairy products more digestible, especially for people with lactose intolerance. Next we have lipase, as the name suggests, which breaks down fat. So it is an enzyme which catalyzes hydrolysis of ester bonds in the triglycerides. Basically, it breaks down triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol. In this context, acylglycerol restructuring basically can be done. So lipase is used to modify the composition of fats and oil, which can alter texture and functionality of fats and oil in various food products. Therefore, if you look at the option answer to this question, chymosin we have seen plays a role in cheese making. Then we have thermolysin, which plays a role in aspartame synthesis, beta-galactosidase, which plays a role in lactose hydrolysis, and lipase, which basically plays a role in acylglycerol restructuring. Therefore, the correct answer to this question is option number A. Now heading on to the next question. Identify the gram-positive bacteria responsible for causing food-borne diseases among the following. So we are given with the 4 options and we need to identify which one of them is a gram-positive bacteria responsible for causing foodborne illness. So firstly, gram-positive bacteria, what are they? They have a thick peptidoglycan layer and this differentiates them from gram-negative bacteria. Because of the thick peptidoglycan layer, they retain the crystal violet color during the gram staining and they stain purple, right? Whereas the gram-negative bacteria, they stain pink or red. They also contain teichoic acid, which helps maintain cell wall structure and aid in the attachment to surfaces. Whereas if you look at gram-negative bacteria, they have an outer membrane and they have a very thin peptidoglycan layer in comparison to gram-positive bacteria. And because of the outer membrane that they have high toxicity. So this is a thumb rule that gram-negative bacteria are generally more toxic than gram-positive bacteria. So now examples of gram-positive bacteria which are known to cause certain illnesses. First is Staphylococcus aureus, which is known to cause skin infections and food poisoning. Then is Streptococcus, which is known to cause strep throat or scarlet fever. Then Clostridium botulinum, which is known to cause botulinum. and Bacillus anthracis, which is known to cause anthrax disease, Listeria monocytogenes, which is known to cause listeriosis. These are the main 5 gram-positive bacteria known to cause certain illnesses. And gram-positive bacteria, Clostridium botulinum, is known to cause botulism, which is basically a rare but a very serious illness, which is caused by consuming food contaminated with botulinum toxin. And it is mainly associated with improperly canned food where anaerobic conditions allow the bacterium to produce neurotoxin. So the correct answer to this question is Clostridium botulinum. Now there is another trick to memorize certain gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria. The trick to memorize gram-negative bacteria, generally the ones ending with Ella, such as Salmonella, Shigella, Klebsiella. All these are gram-negative bacteria, and they also include certain more which don't end with the word Ella, and we have to memorize them. It includes E. coli, Vibrio, Pseudomonas, Helicobacter, Campylobacter. And gram-positive bacteria, to memorize them, you can use an acronym LOVEBLAC. So LVEBLAC, and you can remember as Lactobacilli, Viridans, Enterococci, Bacillus, Listeria, Actinomyces and Clostridium, and another 2 species are Streptococci and Staphylococci, which can be remembered by the P occurring in the name of both of them. So this is just one trick to memorize. You can use certain other acronyms or other tricks to memorize them. So heading on to the next question, we have extrusion cooking is accomplished in 4 different stages as indicated by this graph 1, 2, 3 and 4, and we need to choose the correct option representing the name. So here we need to identify what basically all these 4 stages represent. So let us look at this. So firstly, extrusion is a high temperature and short time processing technique in which the food materials are forced through a die under controlled conditions of temperature, pressure, shear to create specific shape and textures. It combines several unit operations such as mixing, kneading, cooking, shearing, shaping and forming. Food is generally subjected to very high temperatures and pressure in combination with a shearing stress. Now the process is widely used in the food industry for making snacks, breakfast cereals, pasta, pet foods and texture vegetable proteins. So the first stage is the feeding stage, where the raw materials are introduced into the extruder through a hopper and they are pre-mixed to ensure uniformity. The next stage is the kneading stage, which is the stage 2. Inside the extruder there are rotating screws which mix and compress the raw material. This mixture undergoes shearing and mechanical energy input, increasing the viscosity and the plasticity of the food contents. Next stage we have is the cooking. During this, basically high pressure, shear forces and heat is being used from friction and external heating to cook the ingredients. This step causes gelatinization of starch, protein denaturation and moisture reduction. Next stage we have is the expansion stage, where finally the cooked material exits the die at a high pressure, and as this happens, it encounters normal atmospheric conditions. Steam and water rapidly escape, causing the material to expand and develop its final texture. So the correct answer to this question is option number C, because the first stage is feeding, second kneading, then cooking, and then finally expansion. Now heading on to question number 10, match the method or the value used for measuring lipid characteristics in column 1 with those prepared in column 2. So we have thiobarbituric test, Rancimat peroxide value and iodine value, and we need to tell what are they used to measure. So now let us look at these one by one. Firstly, we have thyrobarbituric acid test. Basically, it is used to measure lipid oxidation in food products. Now, particularly important here is that it is actually used to detect secondary oxidation products, which include melanodialdehyde. So basically, as the name suggests, it contains 2 aldehyde groups. As the name suggests, dialdehyde, 2 aldehyde groups, one over here and one over here. So basically, it indicates the extent of oxidation by detecting, as we can see, these are carbonyl compounds, right? So it helps to detect carbonyl compounds formed during the oxidation process, and as just discussed, that it helps in detecting actually the secondary oxidation products, right, such as carbonyl compounds, and this happens by forming a pink complex which can be detected spectrophotometrically. Next is Rancimat test, which determines the oxidative stability of fats and oil by detecting the time it takes for oxidation to reach a critical level. Now, in order to determine at what particular time the oil will reach a critical level, what happens is induction time is calculated by how long oil resists oxidation under accelerated conditions. So this test is actually done in accelerated conditions by heating the oil at 100 to 140 degrees Celsius while air is passed through it. So air is passed in order to accelerate the reaction, and what will happen is oxidation will occur and volatile organic compounds are carried into water chamber where they increase the electrical conductivity. So the acids formed will increase the electrical conductivity of the water, and a sharp rise in the conductivity helps to determine the induction time, indicating the oil's resistance to oxidation. So longer the induction time, higher is the oxidative stability. Therefore, Rancy-Mate method is actually used to calculate the induction time. Next, we have peroxide value, which measures the number of peroxides and hydroperoxides, which are basically the primary oxidation products now during the initial stages of fat and oil oxidation. It is expressed as milliequivalents of active oxygen per kilogram of fat or oil. So this will help us to tell whether the oxidation process basically has started taking place in the fat or oil or not, by identifying the primary oxidation compounds. The iodine value will measure the degree of unsaturation in the fats or oil by quantifying the amount of iodine absorbed by the double bonds. So more is the degree of unsaturation, they absorb more iodine, and the amount of iodine absorbed helps to tell the unsaturation degree. So it is given as grams per iodine absorbed per 100 gram of fat or oil. Therefore, the correct answer to this question, so we have thiobarbituric test, which we have seen basically helps to test the carbonyl content. Rancy-Mate method, which will give us the induction time, which is the and then peroxide value, which will basically give the hydroperoxide content, and iodine value, which will give the degree of unsaturation. Therefore, the correct answer to this question is option number A. Now heading on to the last question, which is identify the correct pair of governing law with respective process operations. So 4 different laws are given to us and we need to identify the correct match. So let us look at them one by one. Firstly, we have Stokes' law, which is used to find the force with which an object falls or rises through a fluid experienced by an object, which is known as drag force. Now this drag force, basically on the principle of drag force, we calculate terminal velocity. So this law basically describes terminal velocity of a small particle falling through a fluid, or with respect to considering factors such as particle size and fluid viscosity. Then we have Kirchhoff's law, which basically relates to emission and absorption of radiation by objects and is applicable to radiation heat transfer. Next, we have Fourier law, which basically describes the rate of heat transfer through a material due to temperature gradient, and therefore it governs the conduction heat transfer. Next, we have Fick's law, which describes the diffusion process and it governs the molecular diffusion. So basically how particles or molecules behave from higher to lower concentration areas. Therefore, if you look at these pairs, so it is given Stokes' law as mass transfer. This is not correct because we have seen that Stokes' law helps to determine drag force or terminal velocity. Kirchhoff's law is given as radiation heat transfer, which we have just seen is the correct option. Fourier law helps to determine conduction heat transfer. This is also the correct option. Fick's law helps to determine molecular diffusion. This is also the correct option. Therefore, the correct answer to this question will be option number B, C, and option number D. So with this, we end this video. Stay tuned with Foodemy for upcoming part 2 of this video, and don't forget to like and share this video. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for many more upcoming videos. Thank you for watching.